Hello, mates, and welcome to the TV Empowers live show. I'm Terry Vaughan. We are live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. Welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about how to build rapport, trust, even in an age of masks, because there's absolutely no doubt about it. It's a real challenge, not only to read others, but I feel to be understood ourselves. And I think we've reached a point where we know the masks are going to stay probably for a considerable length of time. There's definitely no getting around it for those people who are already in the workplace or perhaps have been back for a while. I think you've already seen now, it's a bloody nightmare trying to figure out what people are really feeling when their faces are covered. The magic happens when you're able to interpret the peripheral signals of the person you're looking at, because with half the face covered, some of the nuances, the smaller signals are escaping. They're going undetected now. So we need to redirect our focus to look at different areas of the face and the body in order to pick up on all of the various signals that are being displayed. The good news here is most people are not very adept necessarily at hiding how they really feel. And body language, of course, is the outward manifestation of all their internal emotions, attitude, thoughts from moment to moment, or even their intent in the right circumstances. So if you're able to focus on the peripheral signals and some of the other areas that we're going to cover during this live today, you'll be in a really good position, both to interpret, but also to influence how that interaction goes. We're actually going to talk about three things today. We're going to talk about what happens during every interaction, whether it's with someone you know or someone you've just met. We'll look at the behavioral signals you should try to amplify or play to, lean into. This is whether you're a leader by title or by position. And even if you're in customer service or you're in sales, if you are trying to make a good impression on someone, there are certain signals and certain behaviors you should be putting off in order to build rapport and trust from as early a point as possible. And then we'll look at some of those specific signals. What should you actually be doing in order to promote this feel-good factor and this building of rapport? Depending on which platform you're watching this live on, whether it's LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, be sure to say hi in the comments and say where you're coming in from. I will be visiting the chat from time to time, both to ask questions and also to see if you guys have any questions for me. But be sure to throw up a hi in there once you arrive. I change screens here just so I'm already on and ready to go. So first off, let's look at what happens between you and somebody else every time you interact, mask or no mask. There are three elements to any interaction. There are the signals that you give off. There are the signals that the other person gives off. And then there is the interplay between the two sets of signals. When we ultimately build rapport with somebody, what we're really saying is our body language is playing well with their body language, that we are mirroring one another to a degree. Sometimes if it's a bit too much mirroring, it can feel uncomfortable. But really what we're trying to do is to establish a baseline of behavior where there's an ebb and flow to the interaction, not only in terms of the conversation and it not having to be forced, but also so our body language signals, our nonverbal communication gels with the other person. The more fluid that is, the more relaxed that is, and the faster you can get there, the quicker typically we build rapport and trust, which of course is the primary goal. It's to get to a point where both parties are comfortable, or as comfortable as they can be. Now, that can sometimes take a little time with a complete stranger, but you'd be amazed how quickly you can settle somebody else down by giving of yourself generously and doing it first. And one of the things that I want you to think about doing is, okay, leadership once upon a time meant that somebody big, tough, and strong would protect the village, the community, somebody else. And in some cases, leadership still falls down to that. But leadership really, for most of us, means being brave enough to be first, to trust in ourselves enough that when we interact with somebody either new or somebody that we already know, we generously give of ourselves even before they give to us. And I'll put this in context. When I travel out to teach body language, when travel is allowed and happens, I can't tell you how many leaders I meet or people in positions of authority, albeit very tentative sometimes, who trust second. They wait to see how I make them feel before they open up and start being warm. They wait to see what I do first before they give of themselves. Leaders get there first in terms of giving of themselves. You can assess someone just as effectively with a deadpan face as you can smiling. Nothing changes internally necessarily in terms of your ability to assess the other person. But it's amazing how many people will greet not giving anything warm, not sharing enthusiasm about the interaction until they get something back. It happened yesterday at a range I belong to where a couple of the people I met for the first time, and during the handshakes and the howdy doodies, it was deadpan. And we're all wearing masks. And I gave a really warm smile. I also changed my vocal intonation and said, "Hey, how are you? Good to see you." And it was amazing within a matter of seconds how quickly they shifted. It became, "Oh, okay, great. Well, you're enthusiastic and you seem warm and perhaps nice." And so they lent into that, but they waited for those signals before they did it themselves. Being a leader, taking charge, even if this is all you take charge of the rapport and trust at any given point in an interaction, first, or one of many that you've had. Being a leader means trusting yourself first enough to be generous with your facial expressions, your enthusiasm, your emoting through your face. If you do that first, you'll be absolutely astounded at how quickly other people get on board. But there's this period during any initial interaction that's called a thin slice. And thin slicing is where someone, particularly during a first encounter, thin slicing is where someone takes a very small amount of data. And most of this is done subconsciously, keep in mind. They take a very small amount of data and they extrapolate an idea about who you are. And they're trying to decide during this thin slicing time whether you're trustable. Are you going to be a friend? Are you going to be an enemy? Are you someone that's going to waste their time? Are you empathetic? There's a whole bunch of different human behavioral nuances that go into this thin slice. If during this period, especially during a first meeting, if during this first few seconds, you can give the right impression and deliver enough of yourself that's enthusiastic and warm and makes the other person relax, the magic is after that point of the thin slice and the initial subconscious assessment, that person then seeks to validate their initial assessment. They very rarely revisit it unless you do something behaviorally that's rude or upsets them or does something like that. They don't go back. People are reluctant to second guess their initial assessments. So if you make a really good impression very quickly in the very early part of the interaction, typically these people will go, "Oh, this is great." And then they seek to validate that assessment or that judgment ongoing. So if you are able to be brave, generous, and put yourself theoretically into a leadership position, even if it's only leading the rapport building or leading the trust building, both parties will get there much sooner if one of you takes charge of those first 1 to 2 seconds. It is amazing how much information can be extrapolated by the other person in a very short period of time. You just have to get there first to make sure that the right set of messages from you to them and back and forth between the two of you, you set the bar. Because once you've set it, you've probably given that person the right emotional feelings about the interaction, and they'll jump on board this is a friend train, someone I can trust, someone who is going to be empathetic or understand me, someone we have in common, because we are desperate, especially having been isolated for so long, to find a human interaction. So I want to just quickly jump across. Hello, everybody. Cheers. I appreciate you guys jumping in. So I want to ask everybody, how long do you feel like it takes you to assess the person that you're interacting with? How long do you feel like I'm assessing them? And do you do it consciously, or do you wait to get a gut feeling about the interaction before you decide? So answer that, throw that up. Because the amazing part is very few people consciously assess. More often what they do is they wait to see what their gut tells them. But I want to know what you think or how you go about it during your initial interaction. Awesome. I'm going to show that, Carolyn. Thank you. Yep. Start trusting yourself and then be a leader with warmth. It's amazing because you don't have to be a leader by title or status or anything else. You can lead even if you're just saying to yourself, I'm going to lead this interaction to a good place. And it's amazing how much of an impact that will have. Hey, Daniel. Hello, mate. Good to see you. So throw it up there. How long do you take to assess people? And do you do it consciously, or do you wait to see how you feel before making a judgment call? And do you ever really feel like you get to a conscious decision on whether you like or dislike, or do you just wait for that feeling? Throw it up in the comments, and I'm going to come back and visit this as we go through. But thanks to everyone that's joined in. This is Toppers. I'm going to get back on track here. One of the things I want you to think of in terms of, okay, being a leader, taking charge of the interaction, leading to build the rapport, is over communicate. Because half of the face is covered, and because typically people are not necessarily very adept at interpreting all of the peripheral signals, all of the different ways that we can read what's going on inside the mind of the other person, we can't leave anything to chance. So in addition to you thinking in terms of, I'm going to lead where this interaction goes and try and get it to a good place if you can. And I know sometimes it's like you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Sometimes you will give everything you've got towards building this great rapport. The other person's not going to give you a damn thing back. It's just going to be you working your ass off and nothing's coming back. That's okay. That problem is then not with you. It's always nice in your own mind to say, well, listen, I gave it everything I got. This person's an empty shell. They left the personality at home, but I did everything I could. But in order to make sure that you're leading in the right way, you need to over communicate. And it sounds clearly obvious, but most people don't. They under communicate and hope that what they're insinuating or suggesting is understood by the other person. And 9 times out of 10, it's bloody well not. Mostly because each of us at any given time have 1,000 things going on inside our own head with the list of stuff we're going to do, all of the various distractions, but not least of all is our own internal narrative. Somebody suggests or says something that triggers a neural connection in our head and has us suddenly thinking about something completely different. So one of the things is with over communicating is making sure that you're spending enough time on any individual idea, verbalizing whatever it is, and emoting and delivering, and we'll talk about body language in a minute, to really make sure that the message is understood. It might be helpful, and I've talked with a couple of groups about this, beginning of any day when you're in the workplace, suggest that, listen, we're all wearing the masks, just going to reiterate, if anything, I want you to over communicate, overly verbalize, overly share at this point to make sure there's no misunderstandings. Because too often we don't. We think the other person has understood, and in reality, we walk away from it, and the other person goes, I have no bloody idea what just happened. And you're like, great, they understood. I know exactly where we're all going to be this time next week, and then nobody ultimately ends up in the right place. And it's because we've assumed we've communicated when reality is we haven't, not nearly as much as we think. So commit not only to being the leader within the interaction, but also to over communicate, if anything, to look for verification and clarification that the other person has understood, and qualify before you start asking a bunch of questions that might make that person feel like an idiot. overqualify at the beginning. Hey, look, we got masks on, just in case there's any confusion. I'm going to overshare until you say I got it, and then we can move on to the next concept, idea, or whatever. But it helps set the ground rules for everybody and keep everybody moving in the same direction, because there's nothing worse than walking away from an interaction feeling like everyone's on the same page, only to find out days later that they weren't, or you weren't, or whatever happens, and there's a disconnect. Really, when you talk about rapport and trust, that's what we're after. Connection. We want to make sure we're all going in the same direction, teams moving in the same direction, we're all of the same mindset as much as we can be. That's what facilitates a good foundational relationship response between people. So Chris says, I'm going to throw that up, mate, because that's a good one. I have a fault of first impressions as lasting ones. I'm going to go back a step here. Whenever we make a judgment, a gut response to someone, it's also hard. If we find that we didn't like them in the first few seconds or few minutes, or however long it takes for each individual, it's very hard to go back and take that out of the equation. The bias can work both ways. If you have a bad feeling about someone when you first miss them, or when you first meet them, there's something that they did behaviorally that set your teeth on edge. And that happens with everybody. Sometimes being patient, allowing the other person to give a little bit more of themselves helps. Sometimes it doesn't, because all it does is just give you more of the same. And you're like, great, you're just validating exactly what I thought I picked up on in the first few seconds. But if we have to keep in mind that everybody responds to first interactions differently. Some people get quite nervous and anxious during those first few seconds, and then they settle in. They may have an idiosyncratic behavior that sets your teeth on edge that later on dissipates, and then we can revisit. When it comes to building good rapport, when it comes to taking charge of this interaction towards trust, if you have a bad feeling about someone, don't ignore it, because your gut instincts are, I would say, 99.9% of the time they're right. But just put it on pause as best you can, and then seek ways to look for alternative personality traits that you might like. If after a few minutes you don't get there because there aren't any redeeming personality traits, then your gut was right, don't worry about it. But it kind of, this pause just for a moment allows you a chance to reassess with as little natural bias now involved as possible. So you at least give yourself a chance to go, okay, they gave me these signals, I didn't necessarily like them. I'm going to offer them this, this, and this, the olive branch, and see if they throw anything back and maybe sway me, because perhaps that was just one idiosyncratic behavior in the initial interaction due to nerves, anxiety. Maybe they were distracted. They got a million things going on in their head. Just so at least you've given it a chance. But I agree with you, mate. I'm one of those same people. I tend to get my gut feeling, and of course I'm able to validate, and often a lot of times with having seen tangible signals that correlate to one way or the other. I think I'm going to like, maybe I'm not going to like, but I definitely trust my gut. Even if I don't see something specific, I still trust it. And it's very hard, even knowing what I know, to go back and correct that if I'm proved wrong. Most of the time, your gut's right, so go with it. But I do know, I get where you're coming from. Yeah, that was a great point. I love that you brought that up. That was toppers. Really what we're trying to do is to give the people we meet a reason to trust us. If we can do that and do it early on and fast enough, the individual we meet with has a reason to trust and will then typically give more of themselves. And I'm going to go back to my visit to the range yesterday. Each of the individuals that I met with that were stony-faced, at least initially, warmed up nearly immediately. It was really a very fast transition. It doesn't take people long, and it doesn't take them long because once the mirror neurons in their head start playing the game too, if you're smiling at someone saying, hey, it's great to meet you, and you really put a little emphasis there verbally and with intonation on the great, and you hold eye contact, but not to stare them down in some form of intimidation, but you are smiling to make that connection, and you have vocally shown enthusiasm, it's very hard for their subconscious not to mirror. Very hard. In fact, on the few occasions when I've met someone that hasn't reciprocated, the mirror neurons haven't kicked in, there were other factors at play in terms of personality shortfalls or psychological shortfalls, including potentially psychopathy, where there was no mirroring because they weren't feeling anything. So at least if you don't get anything back, you've got another direction you can travel in to get a better feel for this individual. But you want to give the person you're interacting with a reason to trust first and do it as quick as you can. All right, speaking of some of the body language, I got to move my notes back up so I don't miss anything here. The other thing I want you to do is to then employ certain body language signals along with all this enthusiasm and leadership towards building the rapport, building the trust. And one of the things that I want you to look for, but also be cognizant of in yourself, are your forehead muscles. We traditionally can't or don't manipulate the forehead the same way we could manipulate the lower half of the face. So the fact that the lower half of the face, or the part of the face that could be manipulated, is covered can in some ways be a bit of a bonus, because people don't usually use their foreheads as much and the forehead muscles unless they're genuinely feeling a specific emotion that correlates to what you see. So when you first meet someone, the first few seconds, if you lift your eyebrows up and then smile through it, the raising of the eyebrows is the opening of the eyes, and it's the opposite to threatening behavior. Don't keep your eyebrows up for too long because you don't want to look perpetually surprised for the first few seconds of the interaction. But you throw it up as if you have acknowledged the person you're looking at, and then you smile through the eyebrows up, and that immediately sets a tone of friendly and enthusiastic without you necessarily having to do anything else. Watch and observe the other person to see if it's reciprocated. You will be amazed at how many times somebody else's eyebrows will go up just for a moment, and then they'll join in with a smile, and then you can see them, even though it's perhaps not happening consciously, it's on the edge of consciousness, where they go, oh, I feel enthusiastic suddenly about this interaction. I'm not even sure why. And don't think of any of the stuff I'm going to teach you now as being manipulative. Think of it as using the tools in your toolbox to build or work towards a prescribed response or a prescribed outcome, trust and rapport. So your eyebrows go up, you smile through, you get on. Some things to be cognizant of. If you're talking to somebody else, or perhaps they're talking to you, and you see a central forehead contraction, now there's one flat muscle goes across the forehead, but it can contract in a variety of ways. A central forehead contraction is often most associated with anxiety, sadness, fear, stress, and it literally is the forehead. And I'm going to try and recreate this, but it's hard when you're happy trying to do something negative. What happens is your eyebrows knit together and pull up, and then through the middle of the forehead, it contracts. So this stays relatively smooth. It's harder on someone my age now to get away with the lines, but this contracts up through the middle. If someone is showing you this face, if they're the ones talking, you're not, and you mirror a little bit, and you only mirror slightly, this immediately puts your two brains in sync, because now what's happening is you're mirroring back the empathy quotient of this interaction. You're sharing whatever is they're sharing with you verbally, emotionally. This is a great rapport building tool. So look for a central forehead contraction. If you are feeling and sharing something that's negative, stressful, or frightening, and you are feeling that emotion, chances are your forehead will be doing the same thing, depending on the degree of the emotion felt. If you feel yourself, oh, I'm feeling anxious, or I'm sharing something that's made me anxious, and the other person's forehead does the same thing, that means exactly the same in reverse. They are feeling what you're sharing, and you have built and are on your way to building great rapport and trust. One instance of something that I've seen people do that they sometimes are not even aware they're doing is a single or an asymmetrical eyebrow raise. And this can be sometimes tricky to do, but let's bear with me. One eyebrow goes up. And actually someone did this on a Zoom conference not too long ago, where he was talking about something that he had done or was doing in response to COVID, but he was trying to share that it was positive. But his eyebrow went up on the right side, And it is immediately an indicator of disbelief or suspicion or lack necessarily of confidence in what's being said, if that's the person speaking when the eyebrow goes up. So his eyebrow popped up, which undermined his belief in what he was saying. Now, just to contextualize this, he was asked a tough question to find something good out of COVID and being isolated. He did his best. The interesting part was he found this conscious way to say, okay, this is what I've enjoyed. And he was talking about being at home all the time. But at the same time, the underlying message in nonverbal terms was, I'm at home all the time. The kids are driving me crazy. I can't get 5 minutes to myself. It's hard to hold a Zoom meeting without X, Y, and Z happening. Even as he was saying the positive, his body language, his facial expression was giving away and undermining what he was really feeling. And it was a great correlation, a great example of asking a tough question of someone, putting them in a tough situation, and their body language giving away how they really feel. So if you're talking to somebody, you can only see the top half of the face because of the mask, and you see one eyebrow go up as they're listening to you, there's something that they're either suspicious of or not sure of. You've got an opportunity at that point to hold proceedings and go, okay, let's reset for a second. Let me put it this way. Here's what I'd like to do. Here's how I want things to go. How do you feel about that? And give them an opportunity to validate either how they feel and why they feel, or get on board with the train of thought with the idea you were trying to achieve. But one eyebrow going up asymmetrically is often a sign of disbelief, mistrust, or a lack of commitment or belief in whatever's being said. Have any of you, I'm going to ask, has any of you ever seen a one eyebrow raised in the middle of a conversation and consciously processed what it means? I'm going to give you a minute to respond, because I think it's fascinating what we sometimes see. And then sometimes we see things, we know something's amiss, but we're not quite sure how it affects the interaction or what it might mean. So if you've ever seen someone either with a central forehead contraction, pulls up in the middle, or a one eyebrow raise in the middle of a discussion, throw it up in the comments for a minute. I'm going to have a quick look at what's going on down here and see if there are any questions coming in that I need to answer. So stand by for a second while I check that out. Nope, not so far. I'll check back in a minute. The other thing that I want, let me move my notes back up again. The other thing, smiling. This is often overlooked. Chris, okay, great. I have, but I didn't understand what it meant. I guess it depends on the situation. Yeah, it can. And it often happens as well between friends when they know you're exaggerating a story or something. You'll see an eyebrow go up. They're like, yeah, you caught a fish. It was this big, and they remember it was really here. And you might see it there. It can happen in a joking way as well. It's not always serious. But yeah, it's that one eyebrow asymmetrical raise. And there's also a correlation between which eyebrow gets raised. And much the same way as someone may show contempt on one side of the face, and it tends to correlate to their dominant side. So if they're right-handed, more often than not, a right eyebrow or a right side contempt will show. It tends to stay on that same side of the body. Sometimes it changes, but there is a correlation between right-handedness or left-handedness and which side of the face is utilized during those expressions. The interesting part is I've had conversations with people they've had their eyebrows, one side or the other going up and down, who can't consciously make one eyebrow go up. It literally can only happen for those, and many people that can, but it only happens for those people when they're genuinely feeling that specific emotion, because for them at least, they can't consciously control the muscle that does the raise. And when you ask them to, they end up in some pain, look like they've got gas expression because they can't get their face muscles to do what they think they're doing. So it's always interesting to see that. And if you ever see someone lift one eyebrow up, maybe later on revisit and say, hey, do you have control of your eyebrows? And see if they can consciously do it, because many people can't, which is always fun to watch. All right, that's good. Daniel, no, but now I'm self-conscious that I may do that. Yes, and that's the thing. If you have an emotional response to something that's said, your face will 9 times out of 10 leak how you feel, because your body language is literally the outward manifestation of internal thoughts, feelings, attitude, and emotions from a minute to minute. So yeah, it does happen. That's why it's so And people at the end of events for me often come up, they're like, oh, you controlled your body language so well during this thing. And I'm like, listen, there's no one in the bloody world, except for maybe a world-class actor, that can control their body language for any period of time. You can do a little control of a little body language for a very short period of time. But for the most part, it's out there, it's done. You feeling it, it's going to show somewhere. Your body will find a way to tell the truth of how you feel. So if you're feeling it, sometimes it's just better to admit it, lean into it, especially with masks, where the primary goal is to build trust instead of feeling one thing, but then perhaps saying something else because you just rather either move on or not get into it. This over communicate applies across the board. Hey, look, you said we're going to do X, but I'm feeling like Y, and here's the reason. Get into it. Don't be afraid to approach. Remember, you put your qualifier in there. I'm going to over communicate early on, and then do exactly that. Look for clarity wherever you can, because that's the fastest way to squash misunderstandings or things that come back to bite us on the ass later. And of course, that's really what we want. One thing that some people will do, I've noticed, when they're focusing, when they're thinking hard, their eyebrows will knit together. The supercilious corrugator muscle will pull it together, or posterior muscle between the two pulls the eyebrows together, and it looks like they're pissed off. The RBF syndrome. Some people do this when they're focusing, when they're just thinking and concentrating on what's being said, listening to somebody else speak. They get that RBF face on. So it's important as well, in amongst all of this, when you're reading somebody else, to be aware of what's normal for them. What's a baseline facial expression for this individual? Because some people, they're not necessarily mad when their face does this. They may be mad, but in many cases, or in some cases, you'll get people whose face just rests there when they're thinking. So it's also worth mentioning that sometimes people's default expressions can be interpreted by others as negative. I had a Zoom, I was presenting, it was body language last week, and one guy during this presentation was like this nearly the entire time. And I kept thinking, whatever I've done to make this guy mad. And it got to the very end, and he started to talk. His entire forehead relaxed. He started smiling. Obviously, we're on virtual, so no masks. And he goes, that was great. I love this. I love that. And I was like, you should have informed your face. And we had a good laugh. But he did have a default expression. So just because you see a frown, that might be indicative of displeasure, anger, or frustration. If that person just does that as a default, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they're feeling, just that they're focusing. But you can always look for clarification, or pay attention to the people you interact with fairly regularly so that you get a baseline of their behavior. It will help you establish whether they're mad or this is just normal for them. But some people have that kind of face. All right, I'm jumping back to the comments here for a minute. Take my notes down. Has this helped? Is it resonating? Are you sort of feeling okay? Yeah, I feel like I can manage this. I can over communicate. I can commit and be a leader in any interaction if the goal is going to be rapport building, trust. Is it resonating? Because I've actually thrown out a fair whack of information here, but I want to make sure it's hitting. So jump into the comments and let me know. And everything that I've covered here is actually from the full course that I did a few months back on how to communicate in a mask, how to build rapport. And there are a lot of different sections to it. By no means what I've just covered is comprehensive, because there are so many different areas of body language that impact each of our interactions. But the more attentive we are to how we feel, and the more attentive we then are to how the other person's responding to the emotions we're feeling, if they join us on that journey, the greater the likelihood that you build up good rapport and trust that will then serve well in future encounters. As I said, most people are unwilling to revisit an initial assessment to change their mind. They seek out information that validates how they already feel. So if you are consistent, and that's another factor here, if you're consistent with your enthusiasm and your leadership role to build trust and rapport, each time you see people, very soon you'll have a reputation for being exactly that, a positive person that they like. We tend to, and you can correct me in the comments if you disagree, we tend to like people whose responses are predictable. We like to see someone, and most of the time we know what we're going to get. Now, of course, there's always deviations when someone's had a bad day or something sad's happened or whatever, but we typically respond best to people whose emotional responses are kind of level. Everybody has ups, everybody has downs, but we're able to predict how this person is likely to respond in a variety of circumstances. That makes us feel safe. Conversely, when we interact with someone who's a bit and then down and then hyper with energy and then down again and then up, and it becomes hard for us to predict what mood they're going to be in from one day to the next, we trust them less. We don't like to hang around them as much. It's the predictive nature of the pattern recognition in our own brains working to help us find people like us. And those that fall too far up or too far down or bouncing between the two, they tend to be individuals that we trust a little bit less because we can't predict how they're going to behave. So it's something else. Just got me off on a tangent there thinking about that. Awesome. Thanks, mate. That's fantastic. Well, that's all I had for today, and I think I've already rambled on long enough. Thanks for joining me. If you or your company or anyone that you know would benefit from improving how they interact and behave with one another with masks, don't be shy. Go ahead and share the link I put into the comments here for the course. It's about an hour's worth of information covering everything from body posture, vocal intonation, hand gestures, facial expressions, the works, and it will help. It'll help build rapport and build trust across the board. If you guys have any other questions, please throw it up in the comments section below. Thank you for joining today. And I'm going to leave you with this. One of my favorite expressions. That show, I think, singularly has provided enough body language because of the interviews with each of these actors when they had those one-on-one interactions. It was phenomenal. And anyone that excessively uses their eyebrows and their forehead, overly use it, like habitually, their eyebrows are always engaged, shows a propensity to not necessarily be feeling genuine emotions. And because of that, they're not sure how their face should respond from one situation to another. So watch for people's foreheads and see if anyone's using it excessively, which then reminds me, make sure that when you start getting to the habit of utilizing your own forehead to show emotions, you don't overplay your hand, because it will immediately come across as being ill-timed or phony, and that's not the goal here at all. So sometimes some of these expressions, lifting the eyebrows up, can take just a little bit of practice to make it feel normal and natural, both from where you're sitting and how you feel about the expression and how it's perceived by the other person. So keep that in mind as well. All right, team. Thank you so much. I appreciate you joining me. It's been a pleasure. We were live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. I look forward to the next live. Have a smashing rest of the week. Cheers, everyone.